my panel title, Real History for Fictional Worlds. I'm Jay Gray. I work for Artelzorian Games. Oh, wait. Let me mute the Twitch channel. I'm off to a great technical start.
It's fine, Jay.
There we go. Okay, so we are going to be discussing, researching real history because so many games and fictional stories, urban fantasy specifically, tend to be set in a variation of the real world. And even if you're writing science fiction in the future, that tends to go back to history in the real world. And of course, we have an increasing number of historical games which are fantasy or science fiction based, but take place in a variation of the real world. And you want to make sure your history is not only accurate, but increasingly true as opposed to how it is often written. So we have a great panel and we're going to introduce everybody. We will start with Crystal, who is next to me on the Twitch channel.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Crystal. I'm a freelance writer and game developer. For historical games, I wrote on Never Going Home and the supplement Blood on the Snow, which is the Russian Revolution set for Never Going Home.
Excellent. Thank you. And Eddie?
My name is Eddy Webb. I've been a freelance writer and game designer for years. And I've worked on a lot of projects. For the most relevant to this panel, I think the biggest one I've worked on is I was the line developer of Vampire the Masquerade for several years, which involves a lot of historical research, as well as religious research, actually.
Talia?
Hi, I'm Talia. So I've done freelance work for Posthuman Studios with Eclipse Phase, but I'm also part of the company and the line manager for Clockwork Dominion. So I've done a lot of writing for that, and that's a steampunky historical game from the late 1890s for the default year. And also, I'm slightly cheating on this panel because I do have 2 degrees in history.
See, I didn't know that. So
right.
Cool.
Oh.
Steve?
Hi, I'm Steve Kenson. I am a staff designer with Green Renine Publishing. I'm also owner and operator of Ad Infinitum Adventures, the imprint that produces Icon's superpowered role-playing. I have been writing and freelancing in the industry since the 90s. And so I've worked on any number of games that have involved different historical periods or historical research, including writing the Crimson Skies novel Pirates Gold, which is set in an alternate version of the 1930s, and amongst other things involves most of the history of the early 20th century.
Cool. And the fact that no one has Crimson Skies right now is a loss. The entire industry feels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On property.
Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Spivey. I'm the CEO of Dark Creek Studios. I'm a writer, game designer, veteran, and the vice president of Gamma. I guess my kudos for being on this panel is I'm the writer and originator of Harlem Unbound, Haunted West. I'm part of the team that brought you Cthulhu Confidential, which was noir investigation for me in 1940s DC, Call of Cthulhu. I've done some vampire. I'm sort of a all-around history buff, I guess.
Cool. Okay. So let's start with, where do you start? In fact, let's start at the beginning. You have an idea. You say, I want to write a game that's set in colonial Russia somewhere, or you want to write a game set in the middle of the Japanese-Russo War, and you know nothing about the Japanese-Russo War. Where do you start? We'll start with Talia, since she has 2 degrees in history. Where does someone start to look up the information they need? What's the first step?
So you want to look for something that has a generally well-rounded humanities program, but I mean, no, actually. So thank you. Thanks for starting with me, because I get to be the first person to say that with heavy quotes around this, Wikipedia is your friend. One of the things that I certainly enjoy, and I'm sure other folks are going to be able to have some awesome stories to share as well, is when you're on Wikipedia, especially when you're looking at things for any type of major historical event or just unusual historical event, there is somebody who has spent years of their life throwing themselves professionally, academically, and or vast amounts of their free time and energy into finding out vast amounts of knowledge about it, and they're probably a wiki editor. Especially when you're getting into a lot of the historical stuff, you know, far more often than not, the people who do maintain those pages have achieved some level of personal expertise and are generally pretty good gardeners in terms of taking care of keeping the page relatively clean. Now, Wikipedia is still something that you don't want to stop there, right? If you want to check something for like a quick timeline date, if you want to see some names that might be involved, if you just want to like, hey, I'm just dropping this in as like a hook or a seed for an NPC or something to maybe like leave out there as a possible story tag later, great. But go from the Wikipedia, get to the bottom of the article, start looking at the references. I mean, anytime you were talking about history, if you want to get a full and nuanced understanding of it, or even just a comprehensive enough understanding of it, so you can say, hey, I want to tweak this, I want to play around with this idea, here's stuff, ooh, that looks like this is kind of going in this direction, and I really like this particular subgenre, I can hook into that, you know, get your bases together so you know where you're springboarding off of, and go from there. Usually between all of the digitization that's gone on, between the ebooks that are available, especially in some of the niche historical topics, for the sake of a couple of bucks, you know, you can probably get yourself a couple hundred pages of relatively high quality professionally researched and written stuff that you can buzz through in, you know, a few weeks. So if you've got something where you want to get like your arms around a setting that you're not already deeply familiar with, start at Wikipedia, look for some of the names and articles that are getting cited, and then springboard from there and just start trying to find some books.
Chris, I'd like to go to you next on this topic because specifically Haunted West deals with a very different take on the Wild West, something that really history didn't look at heavily until fairly recently. So where did you go for your facts and your inspirations?
First place I went, of course, was Wikipedia. And then I followed that up by a slew of sort of spaghetti Western movies. Sort of get me in the mindset of where I wanted to actually go. Because you kind of need to see what's, I hate to say it like this, but sort of what's wrong, to then sort of take notes that you can reference when you start your own research to build something that's going to be more inclusive. Mm-hmm. And after I had a lot of those, I actually reached out to some different museums and some different people that I knew. One of them is actually a sensitivity reader on the book. And they're a First Nations person that's given me a lot of insight that my research couldn't find, some different articles that I didn't know where to look. And that was a great first source to start with.
Cool. So I want to point out that we have a form for asking questions. We're not going to take questions directly from the chat. Please go to the form. I just put it into the chat. I'll put it in hopefully regularly during the thing, depending on how quiet or unquiet the chat is. So you can find it, ask your questions there. We'll try to get to them. Eddy and Steve, I'm going to kind of going to you together because you're the old men of the channel of the things. You guys have the most experience writing in the thing. You know, back to Vampire, back to Shadowrun, and I'd like to get your take on how things have changed from the early days when you had to know that this particular vampire was a real character that in person existed in history, or this company, which was bought out by this other company that was eventually run by a dragon, was a real one in the 1920s. I'd like to get your take on how researching history has changed in the last 20 years or so.
Eddy, after you.
Okay. It's honestly changed very significantly in a couple of different key ways. The first is that while I wasn't around in the 90s, I've talked to people who worked on the original like vampire books in the 90s and how they researched history. And it was a lot of going to the library really and getting books. And as I'm sure Talia and Chris will back up, those are going to be a bit slanted in how they're presented, especially in the 90s. So it's going to be, well, this is the only resource I have, so I have to build off of that. And sometimes there wasn't even time to do research. So it's kind of just best guess. Over time, the people reading the books were also in a similar boat. They weren't necessarily having a chance of much research to counteract or refute that. So it was I guess the book says this is what happened in the 20s. That's probably what happened in the 20s. I know when I was playing at the time and early on as a freelancer, I just assumed the same thing. It's like, well, I guess this book is probably accurate. They probably did their research. And that's a fallacy. Now, our readers are much more aware, much more coherent, cognizant, much more willing to do their own research as well. So it behooves us to be more accurate and more thorough in our research and our inclusivity. So it's then at least with Vampire, there was stronger attempts to try to do some research and to bring it on board. And so like you have to look at it kind of contextually from the time of what it was trying to do, what it was trying to accomplish. But certainly the way that material is presented and the way that material research was done back then is night and day compared to how we can and should be doing it now.
I can unmute my channel. Steve brought up a very good point, which is that when you're speaking of what's wrong with genres of history, how do you address common misconceptions about a historical subject or period? Or do you in your own work? For example, someone may think that, I run into this with Falcon's team a fair amount, that Victorians never had sex and didn't think about sex. When the truth is Victorians,
they were horny.
They were. Yeah, they were super into it, and it was all over the place. But
no wine bottle was safe.
Right, indeed. No table leg, left uncovered.
Yeah. Do you go with the misconception to appeal to a broader base, because essentially do you play to the trope because people get thrown out of their perception of the genre, or do you go for the accuracy, even though the accuracy is going to get you called out for saying, well, gosh, there were no people, there was no one from Africa in Europe in the Middle Ages, or some stupid thing like that.
Well, I think that dovetails with the earlier question, in that one of the things that really has changed is that the view of history in tabletop gaming was largely a Hollywood view of history.
Yep.
It was a genre view of history. It wasn't really making up historical games. It was making up games about adventure stories set in historical periods. So I mean, gangster games didn't have very much to do with the actual 20s and 30s. They were about movies about gangsters, and Wild West games were about spaghetti westerns. They weren't about the actual history of the Wild West. And I think that the key thing that has changed is that there is a much greater interest in portraying real history as an interesting source of stories and an interesting place to set new stories, so far as that goes. So I think that comes around to the notion that we really do want to reflect the real history, in as much as we can. Rather than they stick to the genre convention that is usually inaccurate. You're muted again, Jay.
You're muted, Jay.
I'm muted. Chris, you had your hand up.
So I am totally agree that actual truthful history is the best way to go. But then the designer part of my brain, it depends on the book itself that you're also making.
Absolutely.
If you're making a book that says, like, we are spaghetti western, this is what we're doing, you write sort of that genre, but you include the actual truth in it. For instance, Haunted West is sort of a layered book where we have the actual real history as a primary chunk of the book, and then we layer the spaghetti western on top of it. For anyone that might have read Harlem Unbound knows I'm a huge fan of a call-out box. And you can put so much useful information into maybe 50 words that convey what you want to tell, and still keep that rabid fan base that want to see their Hollywood version of history engaged, while you're providing the actual context and real history to everyone else that wants to engage with it.
Cool. Crystal, you are working on a book about Rasputin.
Yeah.
which is Rasputin is almost more myth than he is history at this point. Not only in RPGs, because if I remember correctly, he was a relatively prominent character in the Masquerade line.
Several times, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also in reality. So when you are researching something that is that much myth as opposed to reality, where do you start? How do you separate it out? How do you tease it together?
So I used Rasputin in Blood on the Snow for Never Going Home, and he's basically the big bad, except for you actually don't know if he's actually bad or not. Like, it looks at first as if he's helping because you're seeing it from a perspective of everybody else around, and then when you dig deep into that onion is when you start to cry. And so we presented it, or I presented it, and the writers on the team helped to definitely support that. You first meet him and you're like, okay, he's maybe not so bad. He's a cleric. Magic actually exists in this setting. It's alternate World War I history. So it's a cult thrown over World War I history. So magic actually exists. He's actually a cleric. He is a healer, which is what he was rumored to be. But unlike the D&D tropes, not all clerics and healers are actually good people. And you can still heal people and be awful and corrupt. So you slowly start to find that out. And there is a point in the game where either you are too far down that rabbit hole to back out, and you just have to keep going with it, or you have now seen what he can do. You have the ability to back out, but everybody else around him is too far down the rabbit hole.
And how much of your Rasputin would you say is historical Rasputin, and how much of him is mythological Rasputin?
I mean, I like to watch documentaries, and I know not all documentaries are accurate at all. But having a visual and having, a lot of times they do like dramatic portrayals, and having that kind of seeing that also helps me kind of put context into perspective. So I watched a lot of, like, 4 or 5 documentaries on Rasputin alone. And then a whole bunch on Russia at that time. And seeing the different perspectives, to be honest, I have no idea exactly how much, because so much of that is shrouded in mystery. I took what I could from actual historical documents that I had that were given to me for reference. I talked with my friends who absolutely love history. I am a cultural history person, not a date and like, I will talk to you to death about music from Russia and everything like that, and different influences, but give me historical dates and wars. So and the developer for the book, he is an expert on World War I history. So when I was brought onto the project, I did let him know that this was not my wheelhouse. I would like for him to check, and he has not said anything about it being too inaccurate for his knowledge. So yeah, like, sometimes you just guess and you take the best of what you find, and sometimes I'm fairly certain I will find new history and information that comes out later that completely refutes everything that I wrote. And so if I ever write for him again, I take that into perspective, definitely. But you do the best that you can with what you have.
Okay, Talia.
Yeah, actually, just kind of along the same topic, and I'd also kind of love to hear everyone else's individual approaches on this too, since we're working different types of games, different periods of history, and especially for those who are working on Vampire, that's much bigger, because there was also like meta plot, broader continuity that was being set up. But I think one of the key things that helps well organized historical fiction hang together is when there's a consistent level of how much things vary from that baseline. So you can have, a relatively light touch in actual history and be leaning a lot more heavily on lots of fantasy. or lots of sci-fi. But then when you have like one supplement or one story or one plot arc where all of a sudden things are way crunchier, that's where you get that jarring feel where stuff all of a sudden you kind of get pulled out of it, or vice versa. If you've got a game that is playing things relatively close to the actual script, and then all of a sudden you introduce 2 or 3 MacGuffins that are like really out there in terms of if they feel more ahistorical than kind of the baseline for the setting. That was something that we had to do a lot of work on when we were going through the development in Clockwork. But the thing that was really handy for us is as we were going through and going into a fairly rigorous research project, where we're getting a lot of the kind of the watermarks set for especially the steampunk side of things, I was looking at actual things that happened or existed, but they just might not have been able to be capitalized on. They might have been like, everyone was kind of like, we have no idea what to do with this, etc. So, finding some of those examples that lets us say, hey, we are still playing it close to the vest in terms of actual history, but where we're adjusting that for our setting, which lets the whole setting feel like it's a bigger departure than it really is just saying, hey, we've got these things where they might have been a very, very, very far outlier in actual history. We're just making them a little bit more common, but that makes the whole setting feel a lot more different. So it's just that type of thing where it's wherever you find that balance, just make sure that you're working, for your own writing, but also of course across your team, which is super important to make sure that everyone understands where that balance point is and what you're going to do to maintain that across different types of writing.
Before I go to Eddy, I'm hearing thunder outside, so if I vanish, please go on without me. I'll try to get back as soon as I can. Okay. Speaking of, Vampire was brought up because Vampire is a game of long, literally from the beginning of time, of human history to the modern day, conspiracies involving many historical events and figures. Eddy, I think you had some ideas there.
Well, I mean, I'm actually glad that Talia brought up Vampire, because Vampire is a really good way of looking at how you shouldn't do it. Because really, Vampire has been going on for, with a small gap in the middle, pretty much consistently for 25 years. And not only has game design changed, there's lots of people who've worked on it, have different perspectives on it, but also how we view history has changed. So if you look at Vampire First Edition, it's very much vampires are a part of history and they're an indelible part of history. So you literally have Al Capone as a vampire kind of concepts coming around. Rasputin is a vampire, a literal vampire. And then around second edition, that starts to kind of pull back a bit and more vampires become the architects of history rather than a literal part of history. And then as you move into the late stage second edition or revised edition, when you start to see the cracks show up because the books are being made so fast, like I mentioned earlier, when we have 3 different versions of Rasputin, something clever happens, which is where the writers start to make that ambiguity part of the setting. And that's something that when I came on board with 20th anniversary edition, I made very extended and explicit, where whenever possible, I tried to make historical references come from character voice rather than objective voice. And that allowed us to take all of these, this discordant, continuity of like, how can you have a game where we're living in secret but also Al Capone is like literally that guy in Chicago right there that I can go talk to on my clan meetings. And it's because vampires coming from, they all have their own different stories. And so it becomes, okay, the victors write history, but also each vampire clan thinks they're the victors. And so they're writing victory history from their own perspective. And it also gives the players a chance to go, well, I know that's not what really happened. So in my game, we can twist and tweak and change. But I mean, this is also a game that has a very strong, like, Dark Ages, for example, the whole line of Dark Ages books. And then when we came around to a new version of it, it's like so much of that is inconsistent and that we have to kind of just go ahead and reboot that functionally. So when we did the 20th anniversary of Dark Ages, we just kind of started over and just acknowledged what you knew about vampire history was wrong to a certain degree. So Talia has a really good point. It's like if you're starting new with that, that nailing down where are the edges of the box, how far from historical record are we going to go, and how are we going to play with that. And actually, Steve mentioned that when we got to do Requiem, start from scratch, he pointed out very accurately that we explicitly built that in for Requiem because it became, okay, now vampires intentionally don't remember history very well. And in fact, the Fog of Ages became a very literal concept of where vampires don't remember very far behind. But that gave us a chance, because it was a new version of the game, we could start from scratch, we could build that in. But originally, it was just kind of, I guess this works because old vampires are cool. So you kind of have to, if you can start off from the beginning designing it in, that certainly makes the whole game feel richer.
So just as a note, James's power blipped, and so he will be back in a second. He has to restart his computer, so.
Happy 2020, everybody.
Yeah, right? There are thunderstorms by his house, so. And he wanted to move on to the next topic then, which was how do you blend fiction with history then? So if anyone would like to go with that, or I can start and ramble for a little bit before someone wants to take over.
I'm actually curious about Chris's view on that, because I mean, really, that's a lot of what you do is taking
that is so. All right, Chris.
Fictional history and blend with real history.
Yeah, Chris, I'm definitely interested in hearing that too.
Can I just say that it's hard and I stop speaking?
Do not recommend, 1 star. Right.
For me, when I do it, one of the first things that I do is I figure out the actual real history. The fiction part's easier to do. It's easier to write and come up with once you have a baseline of everything else. For instance, for Cthulhu Confidential, which was set in sort of 1940s DC, I needed to go and learn about all the different quadrants of DC, who was sort of there, who were the different power players. And once you know who those people are, you can build fiction around them. And a lot of places actually sort of have their own fiction and stories and rumors associated with them. And the best way to build, in my opinion, a fantasy fiction on top of history is to use the superstitions that are already in that region and area and expound on them. Yeah. And one of the things for Cthulhu Confidential was that we had to use all of those things, but then we had to infuse the mythos into it. So you're adding this sort of cosmic horror aspect on top of, for instance, in DC, there's a crypt that has a demon cat that attacked someone in the 30s and in the 40s and vanished until the 60s. And so we have to incorporate that into it and give a reason why it's doing what it's doing in functions and cycles. But you don't know the cycles unless you know the history and the politics going on at the time.
So Chris, in that particular instance, you're talking about what we could refer to as secret history. Right. In that, with the mythos, we're talking about a layer of history under the actual history. Where the ideal is to disturb the actual history as little as possible. Yes. So it all dovetails, and you can just sort of be pulling back the curtain to say, oh, but all of this was going on behind the scenes and nobody ever knew, sort of an approach. But then there's also various kinds of alternate history of, well, what if things happened differently? And we have, like, what if, what would the Civil War have been like if we actually had magic?
Mean, what would the world be like if Reconstruction was actually successful?
For that matter.
Maybe that's in a book.
I am shocked.
And I think that it gets tricky. And it depends on the genre, but the more you get into alternative history, you have to play around a lot. In the superhero genre, which I write a lot of, we can get away with pretty much anything. Superheroes are super forgiving, and you can actually pretty much get away with the notion of, yes, there have been people with superpowers since the 1930s, but the world is basically the same as you are familiar with, except for that, because the comic books have managed to convince everybody that would actually happen.
Right.
So I guess a question for you then is, how do you deal with, if there have been superheroes here for always, how do you sort of overlay that with the governmental structure that's going on? Because the government will definitely want to sort of recruit
right?
supers to do things for them, which then changes the entire dynamic of the world and all the power structures, which remove us from like the actual sort of factual historical aspects of it.
Well, fortunately, I feel like DC Comics presciently prepared us because they did an entire plot arc where Lex Luthor became president. And, you know, what would all the superheroes do if a supervillain became president? So they provided us a convenient roadmap to address current events in that regard. You know, the only thing that DC didn't foresee is that Lex would be the more principled.
Yeah, he's the
version.
moderate candidate.
You know, he's the one who right. You know, he's the one who actually like sold his company and like, you know, all of that sort of a thing. But yeah, I mean, you know, it becomes a big deal when you're dealing with a genre that is largely about maintaining the status quo. You know, what do you do when the status quo is not so great and, you know, probably not worth maintaining? You know, as far as that goes. And so looking at how that genre is going to look.
Getting back to what Chris was saying, and you were kind of building on though about like the secret portion of history and the underlayment. One of the things that you can very often find is when you start digging into actual history, especially as Chris was saying, when you get down into more of like the local area knowledge stuff, weird shit happens all the time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
There are so many mind-blowing things that are 100% legit true, but especially because, you know, now if we're looking back on something, we might have a little bit broader scientific understanding. We might have slightly different set of, oh, hey, wait, these were other things that were happening that may have been contributing to how this was being perceived or misperceived at the moment. Also, it just might be things like, hey, actually, I happen to have studied folklore from this area, and I see that like what was going on in these towns over here, well, you know, 100 years before, this was kind of the seed of that story. So if you get into, you know, kind of those nuts and bolts, another way that more often than not, you're not going to have to make up very much before you get to that point of like, hey, this is an amazing story hook.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, once you get to that, that's where you can really kind of slam on the gas and say, hey, this is the special sauce for how I'm handling that with, you know, the systems that I'm working with the particulars for how I'm balancing out that setting. Kind of getting back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, for us, when we were working on Clockwork, we hewed to a one-step rule, that we had to make sure that there was whatever we were presenting in the book, it was nothing more, we couldn't go more than one step, sometimes a big step, but no more than one step from some actual historical basis. So like one of my favorite examples of this is it was actually 100% possible to have light speed telecommunications technology in 1880.
What?
Because yeah, no, this is all 100% true. You can look it up. So in the 1840s, there was a gentleman. Let me just double check his name because I do always forget this, to my shame. That Daniel Colladin and Jacques Babinet in Paris did proof of concept work for everything that you need to be able to make and manage data as packets of light, to use that to send information. And that was later, that work was used directly in the development of fiber optic cable. So they did like proof of concept work, like this is what we can do, how we can set this up. And at the time, people were like, we don't know how to manufacture anything that can do anything with this. So cool story, guys.
Right.
In the 1880s, Alexander Graham Bell made, and you can actually look at like some of the patent information for this, the photophone, which which transmitted via light to send information. And it worked really, really well between his living room and the drawing room. They needed to make sure that lighting conditions were dim enough that the receptor was only picking up the light that it was being transmitted, and you need to have a clear, unbroken line of communication. So people who knew about one of those things didn't know about the other. So in, you know, for our game, which is set in 1896, there are actually light speed telecommunications between places like Washington, D.C., London, Paris, Berlin, Rome. There's there aren't too many places where you could pick up a photophone and be talking to someone on the other side of the planet with no lag.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a couple of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, for us, a lot of it was finding things like that. And especially if you're working in what I like to call the near past, something that where, you're not necessarily dealing with someone, you're not going to have someone living from the time period who's going to be able to say, actually, but that's still within no more than, you're still potentially within like one step of human memory, because that's really kind of the butter zone where you're still going to be able to get access to tons of good local archival records, reference information. Wikipedia, again, is likely you might see little weird quirky stuff like that just kind of get casually mentioned. A lot of that stuff is closer to the surface. So if you're working like that, whether that is you're trying to take a basis and then make something explicitly fictional that's sitting on top of that and growing out of it, or like other folks were talking about a few minutes ago, if you're trying to say, this is what we know was there, but I want to say in our setting, I've got something else going on with it. I really think that that's kind of a great butter zone for if you're not sure, like, hey, I have this idea, I want to get started working on a setting, but I don't necessarily have a very specific place or time. Look back at something like that, really between like 75 to 150 years. That's going to give you a lot of room where people are probably, they have some genre expectation of it, but they're more at least open to, oh, hey, wait, that's cool. And that's still in a relatively easy, like low-hanging fruit range for you to find info on.
In my experience, I've found that the more of a specialized area you can look at that kind of information, you get the more weird and quirky stuff. So like, for example, there's a publishing company called Rust Publishing, and they just focus on stories of like Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, the Rust Belt of the US. And that's all they focus on. And when I was doing research for some writing I did on Detroit, it was a great resource. I found a couple of fantastic books that talked about Detroit specific history from the eyes of people, like you said, who are like, just within living memory, or like, did you remember their parents telling them these stories? And so some really fascinating textured exposure to some pivotal events in Detroit history that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Another one is podcasts. There's a podcast I'm listening to now called the Shite Talk podcast, which is two Irish comedians talking about just weird Irish history. Some of it's like, the rising of 1814 and all that, there's some of that stuff that they recognize that's pivotal, but also just like, here's this Irish boxer that went to Boston and just like won 95, bare knuckle boxing rounds in a row. And they talk about like, how those old bare knuckle boxing fights went on for like 7 or 8 hours because a round would be until someone fell down. And because they're so interested in what it was like to be at that moment, you got some really interesting, fascinating history that a more general work won't necessarily always give you. So it goes back to what you're saying earlier about that one Wikipedia page. You find that one person moderating it who's really interested in this one small slice of history. You find some really fascinating bits that you don't need to necessarily. But
yeah.
Crystal, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I did. So dovetailing off of that, I've also found that your local historical society will have a lot of local legends and tales that are all, or many of them are oral history. And when I was writing for Chicago by Night, and I did Let the Streets Run Red, where I wrote about Milwaukee, which is my hometown, I dove into that a little bit and found out this is a little interesting piece of history. I used to own and operate a daycare in a local church, not in Milwaukee, but in a town. I'm going to leave out specific town names. And this church, I found out from oral history telling from a historian at our local historical center, was built from the stones of a sugar beet factory that was local, that was dismantled during World War II. After they declared war on it, or after they declared war in Germany, America declared war in Germany, they found out that this sugar beet factory had been purchased by Hitler and renounced his rights to it, and therefore dismantled it and built this church. to it. So the building that I had the daycare on, at one point, the stones of it were owned by Hitler, which is just the weirdest thing ever. Like really weird history, because Hitler bought the sugar beet factory for the equipment and shipped it to Germany before the war. And then when the war was declared, he gave up all ownership rights in America. So yeah. Yay, Jay's back.
Welcome back, Jay.
Thank you.
So you can find some really odd, weird history for just your local stuff, just by asking and listening.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to talk about in terms of sources is first-person accounts. Because one of the interesting aspects of history is to get that perspective that you're there, the experience of what it was to be in that historical period. And that's often really important to the kinds of stories that we're looking to tell, because we're looking to place people in that period. We're looking to allow them to live there to one degree or another. So, for example, when I was working on Crimson Skies, I read Eddie Rickenbacker's biography. He was an ace pilot during World War I and wrote about his experiences, basically, in the Aerodrome in France and what it was like to pilot a plane in combat, to go on dawn patrol, all of that. And it had a lot of first-person detail of that experience that really enriched, characters who were set in that period of what their experiences were like. And I'm curious what other folks have found, in terms of really rich sort of first-person sources.
There was I forget the name of the website, but it was a blog, such like 10 or plus years ago, so maybe LiveJournal. It was a blog from a disabled man who was talking about his experiences, and for a while he started really going in depth of like what it's like, because he got the story was he got a shot in the lower half of the spine, so he lost all feeling in his legs, and so he had experience like, this is what it feels like to be shot. This is what it feels like when you lose sensation in your legs, and with a very strong detail about the disability experience, both the physical side of it and also then, okay, here's things I experienced, here's things I go through. It's not historical, but it's the same kind of concept of in that first person perspective of that. Another one I read recently, March, was a 3-book comic book series about John Lewis's life. And so having that great, it's John Lewis's biography functionally, but also with the visuals of the time period in that comic book frame, it's first person from John Lewis's experience, but the beautiful art that goes with it really helps to kind of sell and resonate and understand. And I know I personally learned a ton about that 60s era of marching and whatnot, and then just a very different perspective on seminal figures like Dr. Martin Luther King because of that first person account.
Read March, by the way, if you haven't.
March is fantastic.
It should be required reading for everyone, everywhere. Okay, so hi, I'm back.
Hi, Jay.
We had a very brief, intense hailstorm.
Oh. Well, okay.
Yeah, that was fun. So getting back to topics, because I have no idea where we are.
We were pretty much silent the whole time we were gone.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
It was really awkward.
I imagine so.
Right.
Because
none of you like to talk ever.
No.
We're all extremely shy people. Actually, if you don't mind, we talked a lot about the topic I had, which was blending history and fiction without losing context. I'd like to move on to the next part, which is there's a lot of ugly in history. There's a lot of ugly in the present too. And there is, especially now, this is a big topic in gaming in general, especially with fantasy gaming, which is you can create these worlds, and do you create the worlds? Do you create a world in which slavery, for example, doesn't exist, or bigotry? You create a world like in Green Ronin's Blue Rose, where LGBTQT people plus people are just part of life. and no one thinks, anything of it. But, when you're dealing with a historical game that has historical basis, do you gloss it over? Do you ignore it? Do you portray it? Do you make game mechanics around it? For example, if I remember correctly, Vampire at one point or another had a flaw in its merits and flaw system that was specifically you are part of an underprivileged or marginalized class of people for your setting. So, Chris, do you want to talk about that first?
Why are you asking me?
Because I have no idea who's been talking the most, and you're up in the upper corner, and also because specifically Call of Cthulhu in the 1920s deals a lot with this too.
So it's going to be different for each game. In my opinion, you should always have some sort of mechanical widget that interacts with it if you're going to use it, because you need something that's going to separate everyone at the table from that experience in some level. So while they engage with it and they're seeing it, they don't necessarily feel targeted by it. For instance, in Harlem Unbound, I made the racial tension modifier. It was one of the rules that was already there, and I just changed it that much, and I applied it specifically to situations. And I've got a lot of positive feedback from it, because people are saying that I didn't necessarily want to engage with the material. I didn't feel comfortable having a GM talk to me in that way. But being able to see like a mechanical effect on my character removed me enough to feel comfortable to play what you're presenting. So it's kind of essential, in my opinion.
Okay. So, Steve, I remember when I first read the Freedom City source book, first edition for Mutants Masterminds, it specifically talks about, I apologize, I forget the name of your speedster character.
Oh, that's Johnny Rocket.
Yes. It talks about Johnny. Johnny is gay. Johnny is openly gay. And there's this point where it mentions in his biography that Captain Thunder, who is your very stalwart, I'm not going to say conservative, but apple pie.
He's conservative. He is.
Yeah. He says, I don't care. He does his job. And at the time, this was what, early 2000s?
Yeah, about 2001, 2002.
For the most part, Cyberpunk had talked a bit about gay and transgender characters, but very few other games, for the most part, did, and that struck me. So, I like your perspective too.
Well, I mean, about that specifically, or
well, I mean, you wrote it in at a time when people weren't talking much about it, and obviously
that's why I wrote it in.
Yes. Well, let's talk about it then, and talking about it as a way to talk about it.
Basically, it just came down to I was queer. I didn't see a whole lot of queer characters in gaming. I was writing, and I eventually said to myself, hey, why am I not writing some queer characters, as far as that goes? And when I was writing Shadowrun, I was doing not my first novels, actually, because that was a process. But while I was writing Shadowrun novels, I eventually said, hey, can I write a queer protagonist? And FASA was fine with that, and I did. And so by the time I came around to when I was designing a superhero setting, I was like, well, I want to make one of the major superhero characters queer. So therefore there was Johnny. He's somewhat inspired by various current events in the comics, which were also, kind of starting to get into the process of having some queer characters and the like. And so, yeah, it was just something that was important to me so far as that goes. I was lucky in terms of Freedom City, because Freedom City is a contemporary setting. So it was dealing with queer issues in a contemporary context, which is actually relatively easy comparatively, because we can use modern language and modern historical examples and trends and culture and all of that as a pointer. All I had to do in Freedom City was say, Johnny's gay and he's out. And everybody totally understood what I was saying as far as that goes. If I want to portray same-sex romance in a historical context, then it gets into the whole, well, how does this culture describe that? And what does that look like there? And what language should I be using in relationship to that? And a whole raft of other things. you know, in terms of, because you talked very briefly about, you know, what do you do when you're creating your world? One of my pet peeves for world design is very well-intentioned people who think that just deleting homophobia and transphobia is enough as far as their design is concerned. That just, oh, this world, everybody's cool with it. That's, you know, like, there's a whole lot of string attached to that homophobia and transphobia that dig deeper. You're going to find a whole lot of other things, like, say, misogyny, that are attached to those things, and the roles of women and the notions of gender, and, you know, a whole lot of other stuff that it implies about your setting. If you just say that, you know, queer people are okay in this setting.
Cool. Crystal has to leave us soon for another show.
Yep.
So she wanted to say something before she left. And then I think I
Yes.
want to go to Talia, because Talia has some things to say as well.
So very quickly, play games that challenge your perspectives, knowing that you will make mistakes, and that is okay. These creators make these games for you to learn. So grow as a person, learn, and become a better human. I've got to go.
Okay, thank you for coming.
Bye.
Okay, now Talia, before you say things, I was literally going to go to you next anyway, because we both work on Victorian games. And what many people don't know is Victorian society was this great blossoming of gender, playing with gender boundaries, where you had, for the first time, people openly dressing in clothes not traditionally assigned to their gender by society, as well as in places like Paris and Germany, the Germany's explorations for the first time of what it meant to be queer in various forms. But so I wanted to talk to you about that as someone who has done Victorian a game, but I think you also want to talk about something just in general.
Yeah, so I want to start off by just kind of stitching together a few different threads of conversation that have come up. So one, you should be looking outside your own perspective, right? If you're building a world, you don't have every perspective in there. Talk to other people, look for sources that aren't the first thing or the top of your Google search results list when you're checking things out. Chris mentioned sensitivity readers. That is hugely important. If you yourself are not part of a community and you're investing serious column inches into trying to describe things, whether that's a parallel, whether that's a metaphor, whether that's a direct writing about another community, make sure that you have eyes and ears from that community on that work before it goes into the public. You know, as Crystal just said, yes, we play games because we're humans. We want to explore things. We want to explore connections. We want to move stuff around. You're probably listening to this because you have a million ideas that you want to try to play with. You want people to go and start being in that sandbox with you. That's awesome. Like, seize onto that. Play games with other people that look and sound and act and have had different life experiences than you have. It's going to be a really fun time around the table, and you're probably going to make some good connections with people. But kind of getting back to some of the other things we talked about, where Steve and Eddy had both mentioned, like direct first-person accounts and sources. Chris had talked about like working with things that are challenging the notions of history. Two things that are critically important that even trained historians can sometimes forget. People then and there, wherever then and there are for you in the setting you're working on, are just as varied, thoughtful, and sophisticated as you are. In some cases, maybe even a little bit more so, certainly true for me. Humanity has always been unimaginably diverse. So saying that in your world things are different, or that you have social organizations, the way that people interact with each other, especially if you're adding other fantastical elements into the world, saying that things are really all over the place and you've got a lot of variety, that's awesome. Like, things do not have to be homogenous. Two, make sure you're also aware that people from underrepresented groups and identities in many cases have actively had parts of their history effaced. I cannot emphasize that enough. One of the things that right now, as a historian and as a human being, like, it breaks my heart that we don't have, is the work of 40 years of medical, academic, and sociological work from the Institute for Wissenschaft der Sexualität from
Yes.
Germany. Starting in the 1890s, this was an international organization that was pulling together and sponsoring research, medical study, social groups, archiving, direct information gathering, firsthand accounts from queer and gender non-conforming people, initially all around Europe and then all around the world. That was destroyed by the Nazis. They spent months literally going through like libraries and back catalogs of publishing houses, finding anything and everything they could about that and destroying it. And that's the same thing that reactionary forces throughout history, not just recent history, not just in Europe, the US, all around the world, minorities and underrepresented groups have had their history actively suppressed and destroyed. So when you are approaching whatever world you're working on, whatever setting has got you excited, just because you don't see some firsthand account jumping up in front of you on your first couple of things you look at, doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that usually you're going to have to do more digging to try to find those voices, or you might have to interpolate where there's space for you to fill in. Because if all of a sudden you keep seeing records where you're like, hey, wait a second, like, I know that in this time period these different cultures were interacting, and I just don't seem to find any records that mention anything about like these people or this culture. Well, that was probably a hole or a bunch of pages that were getting ripped out of textbooks or history records somewhere. So when you find places like that, using games, using fiction, using your creativity, if you do the groundwork to go and try to find other voices that are coming from that perspective, even if it's not directly that perspective, trying to find those and then using that so you can try to fill in those holes or point out those places and direct your players to them. That can be hugely helpful. And also, again, personally, huge fan of the call out box. In Clockwork and in work that I've done on Eclipse Phase, we have, myself, many other writers, other folks on the editorial team, you will see that there are places, especially where you start getting into some of the squickier aspects of human behavior and misbehavior around bias, prejudice, etc. Take a moment to talk to the people reading the book or reading the adventure. Make sure that you are pointing out where you can use those mechanical interventions to say this is a way to interact with and this is a way to represent how this is happening in the game and its effects on characters, without having it be a situation where I, as the storyteller at the table, am now like leaning over and demeaning you to your face. No one wants that at the table. And you can have difficult, complex, like heart-rending games without ever having that come up. So find those holes, point people towards them. And that doesn't have to be every session, that doesn't have to be every game, that doesn't have to be a huge focus of like what you're writing about, but make sure you're at least acknowledging that it's there. Because for people from minority and underrepresented communities, making sure that you're making clear in your text, you have got a seat at the table right next to me to play this game, that's huge.
Chris?
So I want to add on a little bit to what Talia was saying, that one of the most important things that I found is that you have to confirm and then verify, because you're presenting something a lot of people don't know or don't want to engage with purposely. And I will go to some of the negative things I've encountered. They will actively attack what you're trying to do and then try to say that this fact isn't correct and find one specific point to bring down the entire house. And then it'll build sort of a momentum. So it's incredibly important that when you find that first source, you find additional sources to confirm that source, and that you list those. And the other important part about that is that there are different waves of historians. For instance, I'll go back to Reconstruction. Reconstruction was this amazing thing that should have happened that didn't, and it was strangled to death in more compromises than I have time to discuss right now. But then you have like a wave of historians that hit after around the 30s that talked about how Reconstruction was this horrible thing, and they bought into like the false narrative that the South had all about states' rights. And that went on for 40, 50 years until around the 60s or 70s, where it slowly started to transition. And you have to find out the proper historian and their work to follow up with. So confirm and verify.
I want to do one more topic, and then we're going to spend the rest of the seminar on questions. And this is about language. Language is important when you're writing a historical game. Language can help you be immersed into the period in a way. When I'm doing a Castle Falkenstein, being more flowery and Victorian in my writing helps people get into the mood of the characters they're going to inhabit. But language also changes, especially when it comes to marginalized groups. The words we use today for people of color, for people who are transgender or gay, for people who are disabled, that those words have changed tremendously, and words that we were once perfectly acceptable are now essentially slurs, or they are out of date at the very least. So when it comes to language and in fiction, and I'm talking both on a meta level where you're describing, say, setting, but you're not in character, and in character when a character, like Eddie was saying with Vampire, when a character is saying something, how important is it? Where do you find that balance? What language do you use? Do you use modern language, or do you use period language? And I'm going to open that up because I think everyone here has a perspective on that.
I'll actually start because I know this is something I've been recently struggling with, particularly on the disability side, because a lot of the passe language able-bodied people aren't familiar with. They aren't realized that, oh, you can't say cripple anymore, kind of thing, and so you have to actually educate them on like, here's why we're using language we use. So I find like if you're putting the language into the mouth of a character, having some kind of rebuttal in the fiction helps to kind of contextualize it for the reader. So it's okay for characters to have horrible viewpoints, but it does require to have someone there to say, hey, it's not okay. I think, and for a while when I started doing this, I was like, well, maybe this isn't authentic, whatnot. But as I started doing my own research, I realized that when we historically start to make a sea change, it's usually 10, 20, 30 years after people started realizing it was not okay. So there are certainly people in those time periods who are standing up for these rights and are standing up against people and saying, no, you shouldn't be doing this, shouldn't be saying that. So it is valid to put characters in the situations to refute those points. So you can make it authentic without presenting that viewpoint as the default and acceptable viewpoint. So if you start doing things like that, that's one side of it. The other side is that if you're trying to do like neutral language, like you're just presenting the game worlds objectively, then you absolutely should be using modern language because you're writing it for a modern audience. You're not writing it for a Victorian audience. So you absolutely explicitly should be saying, this is the language we're using. And then again, like Talia and Chris said, maybe you have to do a call out and say, we're going to use this kind of language in these characters' voices. This is why they're saying this. I know, for example, there was a call out about that to go back to March. It's like, we're going to use 60s appropriate language to express the viewpoints of white people towards the main characters of this book. Be ready for that, because they want to make it as authentic as possible, but they also gave some context for that. So I think as long as you're providing context, you can use authentic language, but you cannot use it. You have to use it knowingly. You have to use it intentionally. You cannot casually use it.
Anyone want to add anything to that, or shall we go on to questions? Okay. I want to point out something that was brought up in chat. It's very cool, and I agree. There are a couple of different tools out there for consent in gaming and for exploring boundaries. Specifically, Monte Cook Games has something whose name I forget from Jermaine about that, as well as the TTRPG Safety Toolkit, which was just nominated for an Emmy. from Kiana Sunrise, I think is the right name. And she's going to kill me if I get it wrong. I apologize. Or they are going to kill me when I get it wrong. I apologize to them about it. If I got names wrong, I am terrible with names, which is funny because I write historical games. Names and date are not my thing. But we're going to get to questions. So question 1 is from Brother Wes, and it was, how often do you reach out to museums or other establishments that focus on history of what you're looking into, and how easy is it to work with them? I have never called a museum in my life except for to find out when they're open. But maybe one of you have.
So I guess I'll start, having contacted a slew of museums, historical societies, and pretty much anyone else that would talk to me. It's usually whenever I need specific information, I'm having a problem finding. For instance, Cthulhu Confidential, when I was writing, when I was sort of a 1930s conservative conservation camp set in 1935 Vermont, and there were no maps, there was nothing. I reached out to a couple of historical societies in Vermont, and I got an email within an hour. And then I had like one of the best talks that I had in my entire life with someone about Vermont in the 30s, like this camp. And then they sent me this massive 7-foot long map of the camp in detail.
Wow.
Nice.
So, larger museums usually don't have the time to interact with you like that. But if you find smaller places, they know the people to talk to for you. And then they'll connect that person. You already have sort of an inroad, and they will give you more information than you can use. I have enough information to write 4 books on Vermont that I will never write.
I think, and I think New England is overrepresented in this group, because if I'm counting, at least 3 of us are from New England. So I just want to say that New England is particularly proud of its history, and historical societies are very strongly represented in New England, and they will happily talk to you because they're happy anyone will talk to them, because so often history gets ignored, and so you have these very passionate people who they want to share the stuff with the world, and the world's not coming to them.
Well, I'm from Alabama, and they're really proud of their history, unfortunately, and they will also unfortunately.
Yeah. That's a good point. And yeah, New England history in many cases, Chris and I are both big fans of 1776. And anyone who's watched that knows that New England is not lily white when it comes to the matters of past ugliness.
Yeah, indeed. I will say that, you know, to some degree, the internet has depreciated our appreciation for librarians. And librarians are marvelous people with magical powers. And a reference librarian will be able to find unbelievable resources if you make friends with your local library and say, hey, I'm digging up, you know, obscure research on this thing. They love finding that stuff.
And also, in my experience, usually the magic words, hey, I'm writing a book, will also open a lot of doors.
Yes.
Because people love talking to writers.
Yes. Yep. And as it turns out, librarians love books.
Funny story.
So we've talked a little bit about this next question, but I think it is an important one to restate, and also because it applies not just to history, but as we all know, it's hard to write a fantasy culture without some grounding in a real culture to exist. They tend to go over often in very poor ways. So let's talk about that. When P-Fort is asking, when researching cultures without a written history, or where history is subjective or symbolic, for example, the mound builders in the United States, or the America, because certainly they predate the United States by quite a bit. What are your tips and tricks not to fall into current tropes or tropes of what that culture was like? How do you represent them? You can't do it exactly accurately, but how do you represent them without turning it into just a cringy, tropey horror show?
Do the opposite of Tolkien.
That is fair. That is fair.
That really amazing.
I mean, nothing can really follow that up because that's just. But I would say, like, one thing to bear in mind. I got it easy because when we were doing that, we were sticking relatively close to it. But if you're dealing with something like that where you really can't get back to primary sources, figure out what you are trying. Why are you looking back at that as your particular inspiration? Because way too often, like this is one of the original sins for a lot of historical settings, is they'll say, oh, I need a, like, I want to contrast like this city or more urban core that I'm focusing on with something that's like in touch with nature. So that way there can be a conflict between those two things. And they go, oh, look at indigenous people.
Yeah.
And
beware of the word exotic.
Plug it in.
Oh, yeah.
So like if you're looking back to something, you know, as specific as the Mound Builders, what are you trying to use that for? If your setting is there are these large earth megastructures that we don't understand, you don't necessarily need to fill in the blanks very much there. Like it's okay to point to something in your world that you're not going to give a clear answer to. And if that's something where you really don't have a good basis to go on, maybe don't make that the focus of the adventure.
I'd like to actually take this to Steve too, because Steve, going back to me, it's Mastermind, specifically the Atlas of Earth Prime. You had this delicate balancing act where you had to deal with the fact that when comic book writers traditionally, especially in the Silver Age, were writing about any superhero outside the United States, they became living stereotypes of their culture or country. And so because you were writing a game that was very specifically about comic book tropes, how did you balance that by including the concepts without doing what the comic book writers did?
Well, very first thing in the writer's Bible for all the freelancers was, we do not want to see Captain Nationality. Like, ever. Like, do not propose this character for whatever region you were writing. We don't want to hear it. You know, like, it was in the guidelines. Like, don't do that. You know, we did as much as possible to get people who were local to the regions they were writing about. As much as we could in terms of recruiting freelance talent from those areas. So we tried to get as much local perspective as possible. We encouraged folks to make use of mythology and folklore in, you know, as a source of heroic characters or villainous characters for that matter, but to do so respectfully. And with an awareness of the source material. But yeah, I mean, we tried as much as possible to say, yeah, don't do that as far as the sort of nationalistic stereotypes, and to encourage as much diversity as possible in terms of, it's a big world. And it doesn't mean this character, like, please avoid, this is the superhero of South America. Like, South America is a vast continent with huge numbers of cities and millions upon millions of people. Like, they can probably support a few superhero teams, with a diverse range of characters. They have their own Avengers, for crying out loud, as far as that goes. That sort of a thing.
Underrepresented too. I would definitely buy more stuff with Silverclaw in it. She was a cool character. Obscure Avengers call out. If you actually get it, you are as big as nerd as I am.
Not that obscure.
Yeah, right.
Especially not in this Zoom.
True.
Okay, so Ven, I apologize. I'm going to skip your question because I think we pretty much just covered it, and it was more or less the same question as before, but I want to acknowledge that we did receive it. Keegan is asking, and I'm going to ask each of you to just give me a shot answer on this. Is there a historical setting you wish had more RPG supplements? And what about that time period is interesting to you? So either a full game or a supplement for an existing game. We'll just go around the screen. Eddy is currently at the top of my screen.
I say this understanding I'm not kissing your ass, but I genuinely believe Castle Falkenstein needs more work.
I promise I'm working on it. Buy lots of Cyberpunk and Witcher, and they'll let me make more Falkenstein. I promise. Or I should say, transcribe it.
But the reason why I like it is I'm a Sherlock Holmes fan. I like the Victorian era, but also I felt that Castle Falkenstein specifically was one of the first games I saw that actually tried to present it more as just, hey, England's great. And I've seen in the short period that it was supported, now I'm seeing even stuff that you've done since then, that there's more and more attempt to try to present a larger picture than just that small slice of genre. And so I would see more of that and more exploration of late 19th century outside of just that one small piece of the globe.
Cool. Thank you. I appreciate it, and trust me, I want to do more Falkenstein too very much. Okay, Talia.
I would do Nile Valley, Mesopotamian, like ancient history. There's good record basis for it. There is fascinating religion and folklore, and it is just like almost untouched, at least to my knowledge, in gaming industry with any like serious effort or focus.
That is true. You will see. I can't even remember. Did deities and demigods have a Babylonian myth? And
there's a few
if they
names.
did, was it
There's
as
a
good
few
as their Egyptians and their So yeah.
Actually, RuneQuest, Cities of the Sun, and a couple of the other second edition ones, they were polling on that, but that was really heavily reworked into the specifics for that setting. So
right.
Cool. Okay. Steve.
So there's sort of a common misconception in popular culture that that queer people and queer culture didn't exist until Stonewall, and that we somehow sprang out fully formed at that point, and when in fact there is a vibrant queer history, much of which has been deliberately erased, that existed before that. And was, for obvious reasons, much of it was underground. But it would be fascinating to take sort of our secret history approach to RPGs to explore that real secret history, and and combine it with some of our fantastic fictional opportunities. I think that would be just such a rich, fascinating vein to mine.
Yeah, that I know that's something I talked to you about when I was working on the Paris book before I moved over to Artel, and if I ever get to write that, that will be part of it, because Paris. Paris. No, I mean it's easier to find things on sapphic lesbian relationships in Paris at that time than it is on gay male relationships, but it is there, and like Talia was saying earlier, this is roughly around the point where they start really taking a scientific and saying, hey, this is not just every once in a while a woman wears men's clothes and goes off to war thing. There is some real stuff to study here, and then yay, thank you Nazis for throwing us back a century because of that. And
we actually touch on some of that in Haunted West and go into some of the different types of relationships that they had out in the range and in different decades of the time. So it's
Lizzie Borden, with the axe, she had what they called a Boston wife.
I'm even talking about cowpokes that are it
is perfect, and I'm really trying very hard not to make the obvious reference here.
Right.
But
cowpokes is a Paragon class that we're calling it.
Right.
But Chris, your answer to the question of what settings?
I would actually like to see more pre-colonized First Nations in what would become America. Like, that is so much rich history and story, and everything else, and no one is doing anything with it. But it needs to be done right and by the right team of people.
Yeah.
I
would like to do a little Amaro myself for anyone that knows that book series.
I would love to see it. It would have to be. I would love to see it done in China or Japan and then translated well. Roughly, I forget the exact era, but roughly the time period where Inuyasha takes place. To get an anime reference, because it's such a fascinating fantasy and historical setting, but I think it would need to be done on the ground there, and then brought over here respectfully. There are some things, this was brought up and this is something that more and more companies are doing, that when you are writing about a place and a time, especially a place, it's good to have boots on the ground.
Yep.
Yes.
Have someone who can walk to the place and look at it and say, I am here, because little things like language changes everything. The fact that, for example, a lot of languages have gendered words where English tends not to, and that changes the perspective on so much in a cultural setting. Okay, so let's see. The next question is, how do you balance realism and fantasy in your world, making something that seems realistic, but also making something original and creative? This is from Norman. Eddy, you talked about this a bit earlier with keeping it consistent, right?
Well, yeah, and Talia also mentioned about the clarifying how many steps you're moving away from your source material. So I mean, definitely, that is a piece of it. Is that if you know how far you're moving away, but also one thing that I learned early on as a writer is that when you're brainstorming, you're thinking of ideas, write down a list of all your ideas, and then throw away the first three because they're probably overdone genre bullshit. Then you start getting into the interesting stuff. So I was like, if you go, okay, we're gonna set this thing, but what if they were like this and they're like that? You know, just ignore those ideas because they've probably been done before. When you start getting into the deeper levels of, okay, maybe we can play with it this way versus that way, then you start getting into really interesting, compelling stuff. It's slightly off topic, but I mean, we've done this with fictional religion. As vampires, lots of fake religion, and in particular, I did the Testament of Longinus for Requiem, which was basically the vampire Bible, and I specifically got two people who were who studied theology, but from two extremely different perspectives, one from a feminist perspective and one from a traditional perspective, and I had them write alternating sections, and so I said, go further based on from your perspective of it, and then I kind of stitched them together, but I specifically left it kind of discordant because much like theology, it's messy and contradictory and flows oddly. But we sat down with a long talk about here's as far as we're going to go. Here's the stuff that's going to be explicitly fictional. Here's the stuff I want rooted in reality, and here's how we can find that difference. And I was like, pitch to me what you want to change, and I literally just didn't read the first two of their lists. I started looking at list 3, moved down, and always the better ideas are there. So look at the source, figure out how far you want to go, and then ignore your knee-jerk reaction because they're probably not sensitive and probably not good.
And I will say, as much as both Eddy and I love Sherlock Holmes, there were other Victorian fictional detectives.
There were a lot of them, a lot of women too, a lot of women fictional detectives that just
read other books.
Yeah, in fact, several of them predated Sherlock Holmes by quite a bit.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important to say when we're talking about historical accuracy that what most people are referring to as historical accuracy almost never is.
No.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's historical dogma, which is very different.
Exactly.
On that topic, I'm going to summarize Ben Sandfelder's question in a simpler form. Where are your sacred cows, and how do you slay them? When it comes to to history, and as we just pointed out, historical accuracy often isn't. But where's the line you draw between I can change history and it's still history, it's still recognizable, and if I change this, I might as well be writing this in a completely different fictional world.
So I'll hop in on that real quick. What I like to do to point that no bovine is necessarily off the menu is find, if you're writing in whatever time period you're writing in, find something that is at least a major like cultural or regional event, and make sure that you spend column inches presenting a significantly different understanding or viewpoint on how and why that happened and what its effects were. Because that points out that, hey, history is still part of the road that we're on, but that it's not a 4-lane highway that's completely straight. Like there are a lot of different things coming in and out of this. Because then that way you're also still dealing with a relatively stable point. You can focus much more on how am I adjusting this? What are the viewpoints I'm putting in? Am I changing things or adding new information that's unique to the setting? Things that I won't touch, any type of major tragedy or cultural trauma.
Yeah.
if you're talking about something where hundreds of thousands of people died, don't put your spin on it. It's probably not going to be very cute.
That makes it really tough when you get to the Civil War, though.
It does, but if you're talking about, so what I would mean by that is don't recontextualize why was the Civil War fought.
Right.
Don't, you're not changing the core narrative of it. If you can say that, this battle, maybe the other side won. Maybe because we have magic in the world, this is how that impacted the battle or made a big difference on how things played out or how magic was perceived, or change the fate of this one like storyline character that we're putting into the writing. That's all cool. But don't say that huge amounts of human suffering to say like, it didn't really happen like that.
Right. There's a tendency to try and reform history in that way.
Well, I know, I think I want to get Chris's perspective of this because I think it comes up in Haunted West. I know in Falkenstein, the reconstruction is better, so to speak. It works because Lincoln does not die when he is shot. He is saved by magic. And I'm not going to say it's Lincoln that does it, but overall, the reconstruction. So I like his perspective on that.
So, all right. Wow. Lincoln was a racist.
Yes, not going to disagree.
Establish that baseline now.
Right.
Lincoln was not Johnson though, and Lincoln would have allowed the rebellious traitorous, note the word traitorous, South to like keep their enslaved people and everything else, if they just come on back and like let him be president again. It was all about like a power play that he could have used to benefit himself. So Reconstruction would have worked, but it would have been a very weaker Reconstruction. Still better than what we got, but there would have been so much compromise that it's still not what we want to see. And like, for instance, for Haunted West, in the end, we have Benjamin Wade, who becomes president, with Fremont as his vice president, which if anyone knows anything about Benjamin Wade was for like equal rights for everyone. So we have voting that happens earlier. It depends on who's in power and what sacrifices they're willing to make to do it. And for me, I like to adhere as close as I can to history, because the stories I'm trying to tell, I need it to be like, this is history and we are right here. So like if the world was this much different, this is how it could be. So people could see that and maybe take some of that in and go, you know what, my actions can help change the current day in the world if I try to be a little bit better. And
Yep, I agree. We're gonna have to have a discussion about that because I agree with you. And you and Mike probably have some different ideas there in general, but I think you have some good points. And the balkanization of America may play in that too. But
a lot of people disagree with me.
I can't totally just I can't you have a knowledge of that I don't have. We're gonna skip to the last question because we're reaching the end of our thing, and this is one I think is going to come up a lot. I think a lot of people came to this for that. When we have there are people out there very well-meaning cisgendered white male straight guys. They are game designers. They want to make games that include other cultures, other perspectives, and it can be paralyzing to do it because you're so afraid of transgressing a boundary. And we've talked a bit about this with sensitivity readers and with talking to people and perspectives, but is there something that you can say to not say it's okay, write what you want, but an idea to help them know where to start to do it right?
Can I start with this one?
Sure.
Please.
Which I understand you might want to give other ideas, but I cannot stress how important it is that you hire someone from that background and that area, not even necessarily to write about that topic, but to be on your team and have like your team read your entire book and provide their feedback. It is essential at the conception of your project because it changes everything that you're doing. Almost at the start, have all those ideas and input. And not only hire them, but listen to their feedback and take it in.
To build off that, I know when I worked on Dystopia Rising, one of the first things I said was it is licensed property. It's a licensed book we got. It's a post-apocalyptic game. And first I went to license, said, cool, this is going to be a disability parable. Are you okay with that? And they're like, yeah, cool, go nuts. We hadn't thought about that. But let's talk about that, because in a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction, people lose limbs and they lose ability. And so as a disabled person, I hired a team of disabled people to work on that thing. And it's not constant, we don't talk about it every single page. In fact, I cut out some of the explicit discussion because it got repetitive. But every step of that, I'm looking at it going, can a disabled person be awesome in the apocalypse? And I cut and change shit. Like Chris said, it's like that stuff that if you just hired someone to write the disability section and leave it go, wouldn't have happened. So I agree with you. Get diverse people in at the creative direction level of your project, period.
Yeah. Agreed.
Cool. Okay.
I just wanted to add that it's also important to, by all means, have a very diverse range of characters, tell very diverse stories. Be careful about telling stories that are not yours to tell. There's a difference between being diverse and representative and having a broad range of characters and telling someone else's story that's not your experience, that's not your story. And learn where that line is.
Yeah, and
if you didn't ask.
Yeah, to build on that, like, we got our funding for Clockwork Dominion from Kickstarter. Like, there's never enough money. But I just want to echo and reinforce: make sure you're getting diverse opinions. Make sure that you're listening to them, but also understand the scope of your product. If you're putting out a setting book, you're not coloring in every detail in every corner. Make sure that you are getting the themes, make sure that you are getting perspective that's included in how the world is being talked about. Because if you can't hire someone of XYZ identity to write an adventure for launch of that product, that may be a very real budget restriction. But make sure you're at least getting somebody of that perspective to take a look at the world as a whole and say, hey, do I feel invited in the work that you're presenting? Do I feel like I've got a spot at the table? Is this something where I can make a character that reflects me and feel that I can hop into the world and have some fun? And if you do that, hopefully you'll get more money in and then you can make a product that you can get that, you can build out that team.
And it's worth acknowledging that the effort and the work that goes into it is professional work and worthy of being paid for.
Yes.
Yep. Absolutely.
Okay, it is 5:30, so which means we have come to the end of our seminar. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank our guests. I'm going to do the traditional end of seminar thing where people can say again who they are and what you can buy to support them. So we will start at the bottom this time of the screen with Chris.
Thanks, everybody. I'm Chris Spivey. I'm a game designer, writer, and vice president of Gamma. If you want to support my work, Haunted West is on pre-sale. And the more that you buy, the more I can pay the people that are having to do revisions right now.
Awesome. Okay, Steve.
Once again, I'm Steve Kenson, staff writer with Green Ronin Publishing, owner and operator of Ad Infinitum Adventures. You can find Ad Infinitum's Icons superpowered role-playing products on DriveThruRPG and all of Green Ronin's products at greenronin.com.
Okay, Talia.
I'm Talia Dean, and I'm part of Rollercoaster Game Studios. We put out Clockwork Dominion, steampunk role-playing in a Victorian world of Gothic horror. All of our current products are out on DriveThruRPG. We are going to have some more new releases coming out before the end of the year, so keep an eye there. And we are also in distribution, so you can check your friendly local game store. And thanks, Jay, and the other panelists for being here. This is a really wonderful afternoon.
It was.
And Eddie.
I'm Eddy Webb. I'm full-time freelance developer and writer. So you can find me and all my work at pugsteady.com. If you want to support me, the best way is to check out my game, Pugmire, which is a futuristic game of cats and dogs. You can find that at realmsofpugmire.com, which is totally not at all a stealth discussion of xenophobia or racism.
Not at all. I'm going to speak for our panelists who had to go. Crystal Mazur is a writer and educational specialist. You will find her work for Third Eye Games in the PIP system, where she is the line developer for that, as well as over at Onyx Path, which she does a number of products for. And especially for this topic, Never Gone Home. Publisher's name I'm blanking on. No one's rushing to help me with this one.
I don't know either. Sorry.
Wet Ink. Thank you so much, Ian. Wet Ink, which is a fantastic. Speaking of underrepresented periods of history, is a game about Weird War One. With so much focus on World War II, we tend to forget that there was a large and very horrific war right before.
Oh, that's horrible.
And I am Jay Gray. I am the media ambassador for Untitled Games. I am the line developer for Castle Falkenstein, such as it is, and a writer for things like Witcher and Cyberpunk Red. Thank you all for coming. Please keep in mind what we're going to do. This seminar will eventually be up on Gehenna Gaming's YouTube channel. And have a great Gen Con. Stay safe.
Goodbye, everybody.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, folks.
Okay.